Tonight, we are still in our little booklet, A Handy Guide to Preaching and the Spiritual Sword. This is going to be the last lesson we take out of this particular issue. We will have 2 more weeks on preaching before we get into our next book. I do have those books available. If you want a copy tonight, see me after class, and I will get that to you. If you want to wait for a couple weeks until we actually get into it, that's fine too. Just in case you're the type that likes to leave it at home. But tonight we're going to talk about what about women preachers. And this is beginning on page 41. Brother Phil Sanders wrote this article. I love Brother Phil, and I love his stand for the truth and his love for the truth and his love for in how he presents the truth. He doesn't compromise, and yet he's able to present it in such a way that it's hard to come away from something that Brother Phil says and not see the love in it. And I hope that tonight, as we discuss this, that we can do the same, because that's what we want to do. We want to teach people, but we want to teach them in love. So the question of whether to allow women to preach publicly to men in the worship of the church has often made its way into discussions. Those who seek for women in leadership in the church call themselves egalitarian. And Phil references one particular website, but there are many more than just that one out there. Egalitarian. And he says that these groups have claimed to have spent years studying the issue and have decided to allow what God forbids. And I pulled a quote off of one of those websites, gal328.com, which is a play on Galatians 3:28. Used to be .org, but they had to switch to .com. And in Galatians 3:28 is that verse that talks about there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither male nor female, neither slave nor free. We're all one in Christ Jesus. That website says that women gifted in leadership, ministry, preaching, teaching must choose between the church that raised them up, taught them, informed them in their Christian faith, and the call of God to serve the church fully with all their gifts and self. So my question for this group of people would be, does God call you to do something that He told you not to do? Is that a fair question? When we look at what the Scriptures state, this is a direct contradiction of what inspiration teaches. God's not going to call you to do something that He's told you not to do. He's not going to ask you to do something that you can't do, number one, that you don't have the ability to do. But you know what? There's a lot of women who are gifted speakers, are there not? There's a lot of women who are very good students of the Word, are there not? They can use those gifts, but they have to use them within the context or within the confines of what God has authorized. So we're going to look at 2 passages in particular. The first one is 1 Corinthians chapter 14, if you'd like to turn there. 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Brother Phil quotes the American Standard Version of 1901 in his article. We use the New King James Version in our class. So I'll be reading from the New King James, but if you want to follow along with what the ASV says, you can see that in the article there. We're going to begin with verse 33. For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in church. Or did the word of God come originally from you? Or was it only you that it reached? If anyone thinks himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things which I write to you are the commandments of the Lord. All right, so we're going to stop there. And we're going to note some things here about what the text says. In the context of chapter 14, Paul is dealing with the abuse of spiritual gifts. There are people who are doing things that they were not authorized to do, doing things in such ways that God was not pleased. Now, oftentimes we have some who say, well, this is an irrelevant passage to us because we don't have spiritual gifts anymore in the miraculous context, right? The word for speak here is a broad term. It refers to more than just praying and prophesying. It specifically limits the asking of questions in the assembly of the church, so the instruction must be wider than merely a limitation on spiritual gifts. Paul gives 4 reasons for this restriction. Number 1, the law says this. Now, what law is he talking about? Some will go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, where it talks about the desire, the woman, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Possibly it's Genesis chapter 2, verse 22, which talks about God fashioning into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man and brought her to the man. To him, the subordination could arise out of creation rather than the fall. If you take the Genesis 2:22. Now, why do we call those the law? Because that's not law of Moses, is it?
It's patriarchal law.
It's patriarchal law, but it's the first 5 books are called the books of law. So it's found in Genesis, so it's a part of the law, using a general term for those first 5 books of Moses. The court of women was separated from the court of men and the inner courts of the temple. While women attended the synagogue and sat alongside men in the first century, there's no evidence that the women were allowed to speak in public or to take an active part in the leading of that worship service in the presence of men. When you go to Numbers chapter 30, you see that a woman's vow must be approved either by her father or her husband. If he opposes the vow, then her pledge would not stand. So there are restrictions on the way a woman is allowed to speak under both the patriarchal and the Mosaic laws. And we see the examples again of the synagogue and how they conducted themselves in the synagogue was limited. Reason number 2, it is improper or shameful for a woman to speak in church, speaking of the assembled body. Are we assembled tonight? This is where it can get a little confusing, and this is where you have some congregations where the women will not speak during Bible class even. The way I understand this is it's talking about the worship assembly. It's not just talking about the church coming together to fellowship and to study, but it is for the worship assembly. That said, if you are a woman and you do not feel comfortable speaking up during Bible class, don't violate your conscience. Okay? Do what you feel is right, so long as you're not imposing on someone else in that sense. Derek?
I'll give you some support on
Okay.
the worship assembly being what Paul was talking about here. And that is what he says in the verses immediately preceding this and the chapters preceding this. This is a discourse on how spiritual gifts are to be used
Right.
in the church assembly.
Right.
And the things that he mentions are people bringing a hymn for them to sing together, people prophesying, people speaking in tongues. These were the markers of the first century worship service.
Yeah. Lord's Supper in chapter 11. Yeah, yeah,
Lord's Supper. So
the
he's-
larger context. Yeah.
They did get together to worship much more than we do now.
Right.
But when he is talking about their worship, he is talking about their worship, not their fellowship.
Right. Right. So this is point number 2. It's improper. That word refers to that which is shameful or disgraceful. There are some who limit this to a cultural setting. And they say, well, that's just the way Corinth did it. That's the way the Mediterranean world was. And that shame does not apply today. But as we go on, we'll see that it's not just cultural. Okay, reason number 3. Women are to keep silent in all the churches. That's going back up to verse 33. God's not the author of confusion, but of peace, as he is in all the churches. And so this is not just for Corinth. This is for all churches of Christ throughout the world. The practice was not, let's see, I just said that. The phrase keep silent comes from a Greek word which means to hold one's peace, to control the tongue. This instruction to keep silent is actually given 3 times in this passage. To keep silent is not to speak in the assembled church, to hush. An inspired tongue speaker, even if male, was to keep silent if there was no interpreter present. Verses 29 and 30 says, let 2 or 3 prophets speak, let the others pass judgment. But if a revelation is made to another who is seated, the first one must keep silent. The women, verse 34, are to keep silent in the churches. They are not permitted to speak. They're to subject themselves. Speaking is a general term, again, that applies to all kinds of talk in the public sense. Leading prayer, preaching, prophesying, tongue speaking, interpreting. Why does it not apply to singing? What's he say here?
They should not teach.
What's that?
Always commanded to sing.
We're all commanded to sing, right?
In this passage, in this context, again, prophecy, speaking in tongues, that's teaching.
Teaching, yes.
That's the same thing. Is it 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy or Titus?
For 1 Timothy, we'll get there.
1 Timothy, we'll get there.
We'll get there.
It's the
Yeah.
same command.
Yeah, hold that.
Okay.
We'll get there in a minute.
It's one of the Timothy's.
All right, so congregations are to sing together in one voice, men and women. And so this does not apply to that. That is an exception that God instituted, not man. All right, so let's keep that in mind. Reason number 4. Paul says that this is a command from the Lord. It's not just his opinion. Okay? We need to recognize that this is an inspired command from the Lord.
Back to the singing.
Yes.
When we as women are singing, we're not putting ourselves out front.
Right.
We are blending in with,
Right.
we should be blending.
It's the congregation as a whole.
Oh, we're
Yes.
not standing out and
Right.
we're not drawing attention to ourselves.
Yes.
We shouldn't be.
Right. Yeah. Derek. And then Earl.
It is important to note that this is not just Paul's opinion, because there are some cases,
Yes.
especially in the book of 1 Corinthians, where Paul says, this is my opinion.
Yeah.
But this is not one of those cases.
Right, this, he clearly says it is a command. Right, Earl?
Well, if you talk about singing or anything, when a group comes together, for what purpose are they coming together? Is it a call of worship service to the Lord?
Right.
Or is it just a gathering around the water cooler and everybody singing?
Yeah.
You see, so oftentimes, and you're gonna probably get down to it as to where it talks about, not having authority over
Yeah,
man.
we'll get there in a second.
But, you know, that's just like, our congregations, even Church of Christ congregations, thinks the whole building is holy.
Yeah,
The Lord is holy, the building's a building.
that's right. The Lord is holy, the building is just a building.
And so oftentimes when they don't think a woman can say this or say that, it's, as I said, we're painting the wall and suddenly, you know, we all come together and whatever.
Right.
The biggest thing is that it's determined is that when I've always looked at it this way now, where this is exactly right or not, I don't know, that when you have an opening prayer, you have a worship service to the Lord. Until then, you're just
Mm-hmm.
meeting and shaking hands and doing whatever. You might even sing a song to yourself or something.
Yeah.
Or you know, so there's so many times that people want to confuse and tie it all together. Now we realize that when we go on the other side of the wall, what we're going to do.
Right.
But we haven't started yet.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with a woman talking to someone or this or that. Now you still don't want to submit authority over a man.
Right.
But in other words, we're all just Christians.
Yeah. Worship is an
We
intentional
stand-
act.
We enter into worship service, but then there are, in order that it should be done.
Yeah. Worship is an intentional act. It's something that you set out to do. It's not something you do accidentally. And so that's why it's important to make sure that we're worshiping with the right attitude and in the right way. But like you said, until we actually say, okay, we're going to worship now, are you worshiping? You know, until you intentionally do the acts of worship. I don't think there's worship taking place just by walking across the threshold. Derek?
We might point out, I'm going to point it out, that there are two separate kinds of worship discussed in the Bible. There's two separate Greek words. I don't get into the original language too much to tell you how important this is today. There's two separate Greek words used that we translate as worship. One means to prostrate oneself, to bow down before the Lord. And that is the word that is used when talking about the assembly coming together. The Sunday morning worship, for example, that
Okay.
is to prostrate oneself. The other word means to live holy, to live set apart, to sacrament oneself to God in your daily living.
Okay.
And those are two separate things.
I think that's why I prefer the way that Romans 12:1 is rendered in the Old King James and New King James. It says service rather than worship, because there is a distinction there.
Yes.
And I
It's
think
two completely different words.
It's two completely different things, and we do need to recognize that. I don't like translating Romans 12 as worship.
But that's not the only place it does.
I know, but
just
that's the one that a lot of people hang on,
Yeah.
and so that's one of the reasons that I don't like that particular translation of that word in that case at least. Yeah. All right. So the Lord commands it. It is not just Paul's opinion. We see that there in verse 37, I believe. If anyone thinks himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things which I write to you are the commandments of the Lord. So, some have asked, what of the women who have no husbands at home? Well, it is possible that the word in verse 35, andras, A-N-D-R-A-S, refers to the general term men, and not necessarily husbands. So it could be father, it could be brother, it could be just another male in their life. If they don't have somebody at home, they can meet with the elders. They can meet with a preacher. They can talk to another spiritual person, a spiritual man who might be able to study the issue, whatever it may be, with them if they have questions. Okay? All right, now, one objection considered. In chapter 11 and verse 5. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. So if a woman is praying or prophesying in chapter 11 verse 5, why does he say in chapter 14, don't do it? Is this a worship service?
In Corinth, potentially, yes.
Potentially. Even if it is, in chapter 14 he says, don't do this anymore. Right?
And that's consistent in Corinthians.
Yeah.
He'll say, hey, don't do it this way. But in general, don't do it anyway.
Right.
Doesn't doing the prophecy, is that more like teaching?
Yes, but it's a woman who's doing it. My opinion, note that, my opinion, is that this is probably not a worship service. It could be a gathering of women together, which is completely appropriate for a woman to take that role among other women. Okay?
That's
If-
where I was going.
Yeah. If men are present, don't do it all, chapter 14. But where there are no men present, it may be acceptable. And Brother Sanders says that. Gatherings of women in homes, it's not settled in the passage. Brother Sanders makes a distinction, I believe it's in verse 17, where he starts talking about the Lord's Supper. That's where the worship service discussion begins in Phil Sanders' mind. And before that, maybe not as a worship assembly. Okay?
So what does it mean for her head to be uncovered, or does?
That's not a part of our discussion. I don't know. That's a completely separate issue altogether.
Okay, just wondering
So,
what it meant.
yeah, we'll talk about that later, privately. We don't want to get off because we're about out of time. 1 Timothy chapter 2. Let's turn over there. That's our next passage that we'll be looking at. And I'm actually going to begin in verse 8, even though verse 11 and following, those are the more important in relation to this particular discussion. But verse 8 kind of picks up the context. I desire, therefore, that the men, and that is males in the original Greek, not humans, but males, pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath or doubting. In like manner also that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Now here's where we really want to pay attention. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. King James says to usurp authority. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into the transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. I'm not going to explain chapter in verse 15 either tonight. So just don't even ask. That's another one of those, some people say this and some people say that kind of passages. So, all right. So 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and following enhances the instruction that Paul was inspired to write to Corinth. Not the instruction that Paul wrote, but that he was inspired by God to write. That's important to note that. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. But I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. It's clear from verse 8 that males were to lead in the prayer and the worship in general. Women were not to be public teachers of men or to exercise authority over a man. She is not to teach as a teacher to a group of men, that is to assume a role of authority as a teacher in doctrinal matters. She is not to rule or have a place that subjugates men to her will or to her authority. She is not to take to herself an authority which God does not grant. It doesn't matter what the men of the church say. If they say, well, none of us want to serve as elders, but you two ladies can serve as elders. No, they can't. It doesn't matter if the men want them to. God says no. We cannot say, well, I'm not going to take the responsibility myself. I'm going to give it to someone else. Therefore, they're not taking it for themselves. They're not usurping. I'm giving it to... No, that's not how it works. God has placed these restrictions, and He's placed them because of differing roles, not because of differing value. A woman is not less valuable than a man. A woman is not inferior to a man. God, though, has placed certain requirements on these roles. There are requirements placed on the roles of elders and deacons too, aren't there? Just because you're a man doesn't mean you're automatically qualified to serve as an elder or a deacon. Number one, you've got to be married. Number two, you've got to have children. Those are just the things that we can see. Those, it doesn't even take into consideration the character, the moral quality, the temperament of a person. But the family obligations, a single man or a married man without children cannot serve as an elder or a deacon with God's approval. That's not man saying that. That's what God has initiated. Derek.
The objection of superiority and inferiority and value, all that a lot of people like to bring to Scripture in cases like this is quelled when you consider the other side. Yes, men are given the role of teaching. What does James say about teachers? He says that they will be subject to a greater judgment.
Right.
When in Ephesians, for example, Paul is discussing men and their wives and Christ and the church, and he's comparing them, and he is giving a greater level of authority to men by inspiration of God. But then he comes at the end and he says, because Christ died for the church.
Yeah. It's based on love.
It's based on love.
Right.
And it's the same thing here. Yes, men are given a leadership role in the Sunday morning assembly. They are given that role. But that role isn't given out of sexism. That role isn't given out of hatred. That role it's given for the sake of organization.
Right.
And it's given with contingencies.
Yeah. They have to be executed properly.
Right.
It's not just men have the rule of the church. They got to submit to God. They've got to submit to Christ. There's limitations even there for the men that oftentimes is lost in the discussion.
And again, in 1 Corinthians, like you mentioned, they shall stay silent in the church is not just told to the women.
Right.
It's told to a lot of people.
Yeah. One more thing on here is the theological basis for Paul's teaching. It's on creation, not on culture. It's not just because women were seen as less valuable in the Mediterranean world. It's not just because of what the Ephesian authorities would have thought if a woman were to get up and teach. That wasn't what it was. It was the order of creation. Man was formed first. And Adam was not beguiled or deceived. It's not a cultural command. It's an order of life for all time. Here at the end, Brother Sanders gives us a number of examples of men who took some authority for themselves that they should not have taken, that God did not give them. We're not going to go into each one because of time, but it's right there in the article for you. But let's look at 3 points that he does make here at the end. Number 1, when God sets apart a class or group for a ministry or service, this excludes all others. He told the Levites that they were going to be the ones serving in the temple, which means the Benjamites couldn't do it. Those from Judah couldn't do it. What tribe was Jesus from? Judah. His ascension to high priest necessitated a change in the law, because the old law of Judaism would not have allowed Jesus to serve as high priest. And so when the covenant changed, the law changed, Jesus was permitted to do so. And now, guess what? You don't have to be from a tribe at all. We're all priests. We're all a part of God's royal priesthood. Okay? Point number 2. When people allow pride in their own ability to convince them that they can break God's order, they are opposing God, not human tradition. As we stated earlier, there are a number of women who have excellent speaking abilities. But God has limited in what ways they can serve, even with that ability. There are people who have excellent abilities in a number of different areas, and God does not permit everyone to use every talent they have in worship. All right, and point number 3, greatness in God's eyes is not measured by office, but by humility and by service. It doesn't matter if you're an elder or a deacon or a preacher. The question comes down to, are you a humble? That's what you're going to be judged by in the last day. If you have served him faithfully. Any other comments or questions?
There's a men's meeting on Saturday.
There is a men's meeting on Saturday, yes. 5:30, I think is what we said. 5:30, yeah. So, all right, next week, we're done with this book. But we're going to have 2 more lessons on preaching or teaching. As I said earlier on in the study, we're focusing more on the teaching side of it, because all of us should be teaching someone. So next week is going to be teaching someone who is religious, but not right. Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 34, Paul in Athens. All right. Thank you for your attention.